Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another edition of our Justice and Peace's guest speaker series as we've been talking to paralegal and lawyer bencher candidates about the upcoming election. As always, the views and opinions are of the candidates alone. They don't reflect me, Justice and Peace's, Trials College, or any other education institution or organization that I'm affiliated with. Continuing on our series this morning, we have Atrisha joining us. So first of all, thanks so much for taking the time, and perhaps you can tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Well, thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here today. My name is Atrisha Lewis, as you mentioned, and I'm a partner at McCarthy Tetro in Toronto, which is one of the big law firms in Toronto, and I am a civil litigator by day. I'm a 10-year call now, and I was first elected as a bencher in 2019. And when I ran in 2019, I was running as a relatively new call, though I don't know, maybe people would still say I'm a new call. I guess that's a debate for other people, to bring representation of new calls to convocation. And in the last 4 years, I've been the vice chair of Audit and Finance Committee, as well as the Equity and Indigenous Affairs Committees at the Law Society. And I've been part of other committees as well.
Now, I mean, you're seeking re-election, right? It's been another opportunity to go at it. So why continue on as bencher if elected?
So I think being a bencher is an honor and a privilege, and that's why I ran in 2019. In 2019, and today, I really think a diversity of perspectives is really important when thinking about decision making at a regulatory body. Previously, I think new calls and still today, I think new calls are a relatively underrepresented group. Because historically benchers have been more senior members of the bar, but they're frankly realities that are faced by newer lawyers that I think didn't exist, 20, 30 years ago. And that includes rising costs of tuition, rising costs of living, the articling shortage crisis. So I think it's important for people who are closer to those experiences to be part of decision-making tables. I'm running again because, to my surprise, in 2019, I was elected alongside a group of individuals of 22 individuals who ran together on a single issue platform. And that was to stop the statement of principles. And to my surprise, they were elected. And while I think they initially pitched their opposition to the statement of principles as a freedom of expression, freedom of speech argument, it became very apparent to me in their communications, their correspondence, statements made in meetings, that they don't believe systemic racism exists or systemic discrimination exists. And as a result, they don't therefore believe that there should be these equity initiatives. And now they're running again with more than 22 candidates under the brand Full Stop. And so that's concerning to me as a racialized woman in the legal profession, to see that kind of rhetoric about equity. And I think it's important that there is a strong opposition to that group so that we can have a regulatory body that frankly understands what all levels of government and the Supreme Court has recognized, that systemic racism and systemic discrimination exists. And I think, as the Supreme Court has said in Trinity Western, a diverse bar is a competent bar. And so I think the Law Society has a role to play in reducing barriers for racialized and Indigenous and other diverse licensees.
Now, you mentioned the last 4 years and being on committees and certainly convocation and certainly some of the stuff obviously is in camera, but maybe you can highlight for those who are listening and may not have watched any convocation and only hear little snippets of things, kind of what that was like in terms of how everything was going on.
Yeah, so candidly, the last 4 years have been difficult. It's been pretty hostile. Some of the most hostile experiences have been in the Equity and Indigenous Affairs Committee. and I can't talk about some of those meetings because they're in camera. But it's been challenging. Equity initiatives have been described in public meetings as wacky wokeism. There's been a real attempt to really dive into, frankly, operational matters by ventures that really don't make sense. And I'll give you an example. So we have calls to the bar several times a year. But that's a purely operational matter. Like the Law Society staff organizes them and puts them on for our new calls. And there had been complaints about name pronunciations at calls to the bar. And so as a result, Law Society management and staff made the decision to hire a professional name reader. And these are people who have, experience in linguistics, and frankly will study names in advance and practice pronunciation so that at calls to the bar, candidates can actually, in their big moment, have their names pronounced correctly. Purely operational decision. It actually didn't cost very much money to do this. And I understand it's quite common now at universities, just generally. But the Stop, Stop, Full Stop group brought a motion to reverse that decision. And, that's really delving into an operational decision for reasons that don't make sense to me. And really the purported reason for that was, this is wacky wokeism and people should accept and tolerate, mispronunciations of their name, and every mispronunciation of your name can't be a significant microaggression. And those were kind of the quotes you heard in support of that motion. And so, those are the kinds of things that are frankly troubling, take up time. Benchers shouldn't be debating whether or not we hire a professional name reader. That took a few hours of debate. It wastes time, it wastes money, and it's frankly, I think, really anti-equity. And so that I think that's that's one example, but I think it really is a representative look at what the last 4 years have been like at Convocation.
Now, with that in mind, this time around, right, that you're a part of the Good Governance Coalition, and certainly there's been criticism kind of, well, look, you complain about these 22 people, you've highlighted what some of the issues were over the last 4 years. In response, you have 45 deep, 40 lawyers, 5 paralegals under the Good Governance Coalition, and their slate was bad, but our slate is good. In order to have more independence, you need to vote for us now, so there's no vote splitting. And then if we're elected, then we'll look at potentially electoral reform to get rid of slates, and that's sort of the best way to make all of this work. Now, how would you respond to that criticism around those points there of where the Good Governance Coalition comes and why you need to vote for the entire group in order to advance this position?
So I would say 3 things to reassure people. The first thing is, this is a practical oriented solution. I understand people's concerns, but as lawyers, we also need to be practical, and as paralegals, we need to be practical. And what happened last time, I think, and I'll illustrate it for you, I think really emphasizes why the Good Governance Coalition is needed. So in 2019, and I just have the lawyer stats, I don't have the paralegal stats with me on the top of my head, but there were 30% of lawyers who voted. And of those, so that's 16,000 lawyers. So 16,000 lawyers voted last time. And of those 16,000 lawyers, about 5,000 voted for the Stop slate. And the Stop slate had the most votes. They had the 22 most votes out of any and every other candidate. But if you look at the numbers, that means 11,000 lawyers didn't vote for them. So how did they get in? Not even with a majority of votes. They got in because there were well over 100 candidates who ran last time, who didn't run on that single issue. And those 11,000 votes were split very many ways, in part because of lack of strategy. So I think a lot of people didn't use, and we have stats that show that the average ballot for lawyers only had 8 candidate names on it. So people didn't use up their 40 votes. You have 40 votes, 20 inside Toronto, 20 outside Toronto as a lawyer. So people didn't use up their votes. And frankly, my ballot looked different than the person next to me who was voting, for the similar values and skills, because there were so many great candidates. And so I think that's why we came together as a practical matter. It's to give the professions a clear choice in order to combat, strategic voting, which was really what permitted the full stop slate to get in last time. So, the reason, number one, to vote for the Good Governance Coalition is really just a practical reality in light of the practical voter dynamics. But I had 2 other points to reassure people, and I hope, and I think some of this messaging has gone lost, but I think they're also equally important. The second is we are not a party. In fact, there's a pretty wide, variance in views on many topics. But we all have some shared values, and the shared values are, a belief that racism exists, which honestly shouldn't be that surprising. Like, that to me is like an apple pie statement, but is shockingly controversial. So there's common values along those lines, a belief that benchers should adhere to a code of conduct, things like that. But beyond that, we're not a party. We're not going to vote together. We have different views on many different issues. So it's not like you're voting for a voting block on issues. And then the third thing I would say to reassure people is the group of candidates that the Good Governance has are pretty legit. We're 40 lawyers and 5 paralegals. We're from across the province. We are as diverse as the professions on, we have gender parity, we have racial representation from different racial groups. We have people from small firms, big firms, medium-sized firms, legal aid clinics, government, crowns, academia. We have people who have different practice areas, family law, real estate, solicitor, transactional based litigators. So it's really a representative group of the profession, which I think is important, because I mentioned earlier on, one of the issues I had with convocation, historically has been there wasn't enough representation from new calls. And I think convocation often can be skewed based on certain groups. And I think the Good Governance Coalition is actually a nice option, because it inherently baked in, there's so much diversity along all sorts of metrics that actually electing the entire Good Governance Coalition, you'll actually have a representative convocation, which I actually think will lead to better decision making, because there's going to be a greater understanding of different kinds of practices.
Yeah, because I think the concern that certainly is pointed out as well, yourself and the other incumbent Good Governance Coalition members, they're saying voted more in a block than we did, and there's all sorts of commentary about that. And then there's potentially 30 odd new members that can be there, and that if this were to happen, then you're seeing votes that would be in block or on issues there, kind of like the pendulum swinging maybe back in the other direction. Now, you've also talked about that there could be electoral reform, or whether it's slates and other issues. You mentioned 8 votes were cast the last time. People are not using all 40. I mean, the size of the board itself at 53. I mean, what are your thoughts on any of these things in terms of changes to how we select our board?
Yeah, so on the voting block issue, just to address that point. So I don't know, I didn't look into the stats. I'm not sure how accurate they are. But I want to emphasize the Good Governance Coalition is not a party, and in fact only was recently created for the election. So there's no party per se, so there's no directive to vote in a certain way. one thing I will say is the slate brought a lot of crazy motions. Like we talked about the name call motion. And so it's not surprising to me that there was unification among non-slate candidates in opposition to some of the motions that the slate has brought. I don't think it means we're a party, but I think it just means that, a broad group of reasonable people saw some of their motions and thought, this is not something I want to vote for. On electoral reform, I think we are right for electoral reform. There's a lot of reform I'd like to see. I actually think we should relook at convocation just generally. Like I think 40 lawyer benchers is too big as an example. But on electoral reform specifically, I think there are some rules. So there's a consideration of whether we should, ban or outlaw slates and group running. That's something I would support looking into. I don't know if that's allowed constitutionally, but that would be something that I would support. The second, thing that I think we can do just regardless, and we should do, is have some rules on financing. One thing the Good Governance Coalition was very careful about is we only accepted donations from licensees, so either lawyers or paralegals. I think there should be a prohibition on accepting money from non-licensees. There should also be a consideration of spending limits, on a per candidate or per campaign basis. That's going to be important when you think about trying to make sure that there's representations from souls and clinic lawyers who may not have the same, financial resources as others. So I think financial reform should be something that we look at carefully as well. So I think there's a lot of reform to be had. One thing that I'm on a very personal level, very passionate about is making sure we hear from new calls. When voting is based on reputation and, oftentimes name recognition and just, how well known you are, that obviously skews heavily in favor of more senior members of the professions, to the disadvantage of new calls. But, I think they have an important voice to bring. So maybe, in other provinces, we've seen new call seats. So maybe there's a special, under 5-year call seat. Maybe we have a special seat for licensing candidates, like articling students. I think that those are the things that we should be really thinking about to advance, having a really representative convocation.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up the point that you're only taking donations from licensees, because certainly, I don't know if anyone's sort of given thought to it, but there's the possibility of course, of like a third party, with AI or something, and they're like, hey, we gave you $1 million for your campaign, and now you're elected, and we'd like to kind of get in on this sphere. Obviously in our general politics, we don't allow that, right? Or you got to disclose things like that. I don't think there's any obligation for anyone to say, here's where we got our money for our campaign, or I don't know if there's even a report of here's how we spent whatever we got. So
yeah,
I don't know if you can elaborate on that.
Yeah, there are no rules about campaign funding and financing. I would welcome you to ask full stop, how much did they raise and where is it coming from? Because I would want to know, because I think you're right. There is a lot, these elections are ripe for interference from special interest groups who have money in all sorts of settings. You had the AI example, that's a great example, but we're seeing an anti-equity kind of group. So maybe there's other groups that want to fund that. Like, I don't know. So I think that's an important thing that we need to be looking at and thinking about carefully.
Now, what are some other issues there? If elected over the next 4 years, that you'd like to bring and discuss at convocation, and what are the important ones to you in this upcoming election?
So a big one for me is I think we need to do a program review. So I'm hearing a lot of comments about fees and our fees being too high. And I think and I hear those comments, and I understand, the impact that fees have on practitioners. But I think we need to be thoughtful about it, because, and I said this previously, but we could cut programs like the spot audit, and we might be able to save a few $1 million to doing that. But are there kind of unintended consequences? So, for instance, if we don't have people coming in proactively from the Law Society looking at practices, does that mean discipline hearing costs go up? Does that mean, the compensation fund, which covers fraud carried out by lawyers, that fund has to go up too, because now we're not detecting fraud early on. So we have to just think about, unintended consequences of cutting programs. But we need to look at what we're doing and do a program review and do a cost benefit analysis of every single thing we're doing, because I think there probably can be some efficiencies. I don't think there's the volume of efficiencies that, people think can happen, because, for better or for worse, we have a statutory mandate. So we have to investigate complaints made against lawyers and paralegals. We have to discipline, misconduct by lawyers and paralegals. We have to have this compensation fund. And those are just statutory requirements. So there's no way around that. And so they need to be funded so that those things can happen. But then there are some, arguably optional things that we do. But I think that they add a lot of value. One big one that's been advocated a bunch about, and I support fully, is local libraries. And we also have to think of, we have to think about, as I said, the unintended consequences. So you cut funding to local libraries. What does that do for, discipline and complaints and, burnout and mental health and all of these considerations? So I think we need to take a hard look at our programs. I think we need to analyze its cost benefit. And I think we need to do so with the goal of reducing fees, but just understanding, what we're giving up when we give up something.
Right, because I mean, certainly on the full stop side, they'll say there's no stop bloat, stop creep, stop woke, right? In terms of their positioning and perhaps, from their perspective, that there are things, I can't sort of speak for them, but know that that they can be cut. They point out to the budget being larger than some of the city, like Oshawa and Pickering, I think I saw, in terms of what the Law Society is working with. So I don't know, in terms of the last 4 years, if there are things beyond that statutory mandate, and as you said, that there may be the unintended consequences. You cut from the left hand, and then the right hand's going to suffer, right? But anything where you can see or elaborate in response to kind of where they're saying there's bloat, creep, and woke there, that these are the things that they've highlighted. What would you say in response?
So I would say it's interesting that they say they want to cut bloat, but they haven't identified what. And I think that's important. They haven't identified what they will cut. And, I think that I have many, theories about that. But, one theory is cutting something can be unpopular in certain circles, right? We saw this with the certified specialist designation. The convocation ultimately reversed itself. You cut a program and then you get backlash. And so they don't want to tell you what they're going to cut, because they know if they propose things, there's going to be backlash. But they cannot offer you these broad sweeping savings that they're promising without cutting programs. It just can't be done. So that's why I'm advocating for a more responsible approach to it, which is a program review where and frankly, we should consult with the professions about it. We should first look at it. We should first get studies. We should get, cost benefits on each of these programs. And then we should go out to the professions and say, this is what our analysis finds, like, comment on it. And then I think we can do, cuts more thoughtfully. And frankly, with people supporting it, because, it's really unhelpful if we cut something because we want to have a win, and save some money, and then, reverse ourselves later because there's backlash, and then there's no savings, and perhaps probably higher costs because now you're trying to undo what you've done and wasted all this time in that process.
And certainly, you point out I don't know if it was you specifically I heard, but the equity, diversity, and inclusion initiatives that I think the budget is like 1%. I don't know if you can.
It's less than 1%. So that's, divided by the number of licensees, it's nothing. That's not going to change your fees. Cutting equity is not going to change your fees. I think it's the easy kind of, especially it's consistent with their anti-equity platform, but it's not going to have an impact on fees. So they have to cut out something else if they're going to actually, quote unquote, reduce fees as they promise, but they're not going to tell you what it is.
Now, is there anything else that we haven't talked about in terms of, if elected, that you'd like to see more of the Law Society doing in terms of their role as a regulator, or anything differently from the 4 years you've been there already?
So I think there's a lot that, frankly, we just haven't been able to do in the last 4 years because of the division and conflict at the Law Society. But what I would like to see is, I think we need to look at articling again. We have an articling job crises, and people struggling there. So we need to look at that. I think we need to look at mentoring. This is the number one thing I hear from new calls is the lack of mentors, especially those who aren't in big firms. And we need to think about ways that we can incentivize mentorship. Maybe it's, when I was campaigning, someone suggested this, and I think it's a brilliant idea. Maybe it's, we have 12 hours for lawyers of required CPD. Maybe we say, 1 hour is required to be mentoring. And so maybe that, if you're above 5 years of call or whatever. And so that encourages people to actively go out of their way to mentor others. I think there's things that the Law Society can do to encourage mentorship and support for new calls. And even things like we have a parental leave assistance program, which the feedback I've heard is it's, really unhelpful because it just doesn't work. Like the actual amounts that are provided to support people on parental leave is so little, and then to be eligible, the criteria is so limited. I think we need to, if we're going to do a parental leave program, I think we need to look at it and make sure it's actually one that makes sense and works. So I think there's a lot of things that the Law Society can do to make practice easier for lawyers and paralegals that we need to look at and consider.
Now, last couple of questions here for any of you're talking a lot about new calls, and certainly those that are still students or articling students right now. Any advice, any words of wisdom for them as they look to get into the profession and progress through the profession?
Yeah, so advice would be to pay attention, and if you are a new call, to vote, because these elections for certainly do impact you. But beyond that, I would say, and this is why I'm emphasizing mentoring so much, because mentorship is frankly the key to success in the legal profession. We are an apprenticeship profession. No one's born a great lawyer or paralegal. All great lawyers and paralegals are taught. And so, the key is to find, people that will teach you and that will mentor you. I think depending on your practice setting, it's going to be harder to find mentors, but there's really interesting and different ways that we can do that. There's a Twitter Harpreet who I follow, I think his last name is Saini. He's always saying, I'm doing this court appearance and this type of thing. Let me know if you want to go. I think new calls should and students should take him up on it, or maybe even tweet out yourself, like, I'm looking for this kind of opportunity. Is there anyone who has this coming up? I'd like to come. I think it requires a little bit more effort to find people, but I actually think the profession is really willing to support and mentor students in new calls. So it's really about, putting yourself out there and getting that support that you need.
Perfect. So last question here. For all the lawyers that are listening, and as you point out, have up to 40 votes that they can use this time, why should they vote for you and the Good Governance Coalition?
So I think they should vote for me and the Good Governance Coalition because we are leaders. We've all have a track record of leadership in different ways, whether it's on being the president of a legal association or otherwise. We are diverse. We mirror your practice and your experiences as described. On a personal level, I've worked really hard in these last 4 years as a bencher and I think challenging circumstances. And there are things that I'm really proud of in the last 4 years, notwithstanding all of those challenges. Minimum compensation for articling students was something that I was a huge advocate for, and that passed narrowly by 1 vote. But I think it's so important, for people who are working, long hours for almost a year to get paid, a minimum wage, which isn't even necessarily a living wage, but, is the bare minimum. I've demonstrated a track record of advocacy on important issues. And so I really hope that, people will give me and the other members of the Good Governance Coalition an opportunity to get back to work and actually govern like we should be.
Thanks so much again for doing this. And thanks so much, everyone, for tuning in. Take care.
Thank you.